Welcome everyone. This is our preview show stream for the Spring 2021 anime season. I am Theta. This is the 8th time in a row we have done this for the new season. 8s are kind of special to me, if you didn't know. And so while I've resisted doing this in the past, I think I'm going to share the highlights, not the lowlights, of today's broadcast on the YouTube channel. So, everybody be on your best behavior. Well, maybe better than that. We are positively loaded today, as I want to cover 25 new shows. I feel like there is an above average range of variety this season, and so I felt like I needed representation from a lot of different quarters. Every time I thought I'm leaving something out, or I've covered everything, I discovered, no, actually there's something a little bit different than everything else that maybe you should slip in there. So, if this is your first time, here is the rundown. I will have a few minutes to say, a few minutes of things to say about each show, as well as some selected clips to give you an impression of what the series itself will look like. As the banner below says, no spoilers allowed in chat. And that is because the purpose of the stream is to be suitable for those who have not watched even a single episode yet. So, avoid specifics, or jokes, or even whether or not the show has a twist. However, my comments and clips will be spoiler-lite, what I call premise spoilers, enough to give you a sense of the series, and footage that would either support what I'm saying, or demonstrates the kind of style and the direction that you might expect. This is more than I would usually reveal about a show. For these preview streams, for these streams only, I try to walk a good line between helping you decide if it's worth your time to watch, and preserving the novelty of seeing each premiere fresh. This is not me rating or ordering these shows, or making recommendations one way or another. They're just some initial thoughts, what might have stood out to me, sometimes the direction I suspect for a series, what I think its strengths may be. Like always, those in chat are nevertheless free to share if they particularly liked a show's direction, or characterization, or design, or soundtrack, credit sequence, whatever. We just want to avoid specific story beats, and especially refrain from references to source material. Know that I myself have only seen the premieres of these episodes except where noted, and I am basically never familiar with source material, so these are all anime-only impressions. Additionally, we don't talk about sequel series in the preview show, so as not to spoil their predecessors. This is thus restrained to new and seasonal and full-length series only. Despite that, we still have 25. Alright, also, one of our mods, Unhepcat, created an app for us, a community seasonal watch list. And after the stream today, that same app will host the vote for which shows will receive their own channel in the Discord. Voting will run for a week. You'll be able to find the app, if you haven't been yet, at SWL, Seasonal Watch List, .nearlyonred.com. Maybe the link in chat will work. It does. Great. In addition, and this is why that's important to be on Discord, one of these new shows is going to get to the live, same-day, instant analysis treatment that RE0 was getting, now that it's off the air. Inside this app is an option to suggest a show for me to cover as part of how you rate it personally. This is not like a straight vote, but I'm going to be taking that into account, in addition to all the other chatter about these new shows, to figure out which one makes sense to talk about from week to week. Alright, let's get to it. I'm going to try to go at a pretty good pace because we have so many. You can see the order we're going to visit going across the top in the scrolling marquee. It was way more than I could fit in the usual way I show a table of contents. So, let us hope this thing that we waited on is going to work correctly. First up is going to be Mars Red. Well, it kind of works. This is the first of a few shows that... Oh, one more thing, sorry. I almost missed you there. Thank you very much. Lost the bet, wasn't even close. Take my money. I'm glad you didn't get it, because I don't think I had the money to match you. Okay, Mars Red. So, this is the first of a few shows that I've put at the very beginning, where I feel I really need to see at least one more episode before having a sense of things. This isn't because the quality is weak, or the setup is too slow, but rather because there is the potential that the premiere isn't representative of the whole, or that it might go in a different direction than originally implied. For Mars Red, I need to see another episode because I just have to see if they can keep the quality up long term. Like, it's good. The premiere has something of a self-contained story within it, which is very effective for an opening, but doesn't leave you with a solid grasp of the larger narrative. However, as our main character is about to head up a special unit within the military, it may be that a kind of mission of the week format is intended. It's just one episode was not sufficient to tell. So, let me change this as well. Now, this show isn't going to blow anyone away with its character aesthetics, though the architecture, the backgrounds get a lot of attention. Both seem appropriate for the type of story. It is attempting a more realistic rendering of the Taisho period in which it is set, and a more grounded characterization of our main players. It is nevertheless speculative fiction, but I actually think I will leave out those details, going for a little less is more approach to this preview. I think that is appropriate on my part because this episode itself has the same philosophy. What happens and why will not be plainly spelled out, but no pieces will be missing either. It ends up being kind of a fascinating way of characterizing the presumed antagonist that I basically don't want to give away at all. Mars Red is an adaptation, but not of the usual suspects of manga or light novel or game. It is based on a play, which, among other things, means that it lives or dies on the strength of its dialogue. The premiere episode also invokes another play from the 20th century, the early 20th century, so contemporary almost with this time period, and will use many of its lines throughout. I also suspect that play's themes might show up in the overall series, but again, I would need to see further to guess where we go from here. Perhaps owing to its theater script roots, a lot of the framing and direction of this episode will remind you of live-action storytelling, which also suits its aesthetic and the degree of realism. It is a treat so far, basically, but a lot will depend on whether the delivery of the opening is matched over the larger story. And while I have gotten the chance since I wrote the script to see some additional episodes, this is not one where I've had that opportunity. So for now, I hope it's more of the same, but I don't know any more than you. Well, I know less than you, probably. Alright, so, next up, Koikimo. Alright, so for this one, it's difficult to talk about the premise of the show without giving away a fair bit of the premiere, unfortunately, at least with respect to the narrative. It's mostly situation comedy, though, so it's not like my preview is going to spoil the whole game. Alright, so, here is our setup. We've got Ryo, tall, blonde, handsome, successful, loaded, total lady killer in his later 20s. A chance encounter brings him and our heroine Ichika together, and through a small sequence of events, Ryo decides she is the girl he's been looking for. An absolute classic meet cute, the jumping off point for many a successful romantic comedy. Or at least, I'm sure that is what Ryo thinks. The problem here is that Ichika is in high school, and she's not flattered by the attention, and she makes that rather plain. That should be the end of the story, but since I'm talking about a single episode of a whole series, you can guess correctly that it is not. Ryo is not deterred, and continues his pursuit with whatever romantic overtures he deems appropriate. Even if she doesn't. He acts the part of Mr. Right, but is instead Mr. Wrong. and the dude definitely sets off all of my protective instincts. Here, though, is where I have to stop and say, again, this is another show where I need a second episode to get a feel. The setup, as I've explained it, just makes it a comedy, not a romantic comedy. Maybe even a send-up of that genre as a whole, showing how the things guys often do in rom-coms can be downright creepy and way too aggressive. But, well, without giving anything else away, there are a few things that make me wonder if it might go in another direction. It could veer into one realm just to ensure the initial setup can continue, or it can start to reverse it. It's the difference between a concept I'd like to see play out and a concept I don't necessarily want to see given a sympathetic treatment. So I find myself wanting to stay a little bit wary a little bit longer. Next up, on things that... is this meant to be romantic comedy? I'm not sure. Don't toy with me, Miss Nagatoro. Okay, my unfiltered impression of watching this first episode is that I feel like I just wandered into a fantasy spun from the mind of someone with a humiliation kink. And the character designs only reinforce this impression. Our titular Nagatoro has a permanent blush and is custom built to make teasing faces, while our guy is the very picture of a socially inexperienced high school boy, custom built to be the target of bullies everywhere. There was only one way their interaction was going to work. So then, the setup is that Nagatoro is a first year and our main character a second year in the same high school. By happenstance, she learns something about his interests and makes a point to ridicule him for it. But that was just the appetizer for all the bullying she has in store for him, branching out into all other aspects of his interests or personality. I want to be clear, too, that it's several steps beyond the kind of teasing people do to those they feel comfortable with, or as a hallmark of being old friends. Like, even if it was only that kind of gentle ribbing, it would still be a bit much because they are strangers. It's different from, like, say, Takagi-san, if you remember that from a couple years ago, that presumably has a similar setup. Not only were the guy and the girl on that one a pair who'd known each other forever, but it was far less vicious than what we are getting from Nagatoro. Like, she goes for blood, but there's also this undercurrent of forced sexual tension that puts our victim even further off balance and gives him even further ways to embarrass himself. What's perhaps telling, though, is that I can infer there will be some redeeming or endearing, some sort of extra curve to the story, even with no foreshadowing. Because the bullying is so one-sidedly awful that you know there can't be a whole story here without such a shift. I feel like this is one where if you know the whole story, you probably have a very different impression of this premiere. I know it's a popular property, but the first impression it makes is downright mean-spirited. That is why it is the last of these first three, where I just need to see another episode to have an informed opinion. I'm sure there'll be more to why she acts this way, why she singled him out in the first place, but in the meantime, it seems like the audience is meant to let her get away with it because she's a cute girl who's at least paying some kind of attention to our hapless protagonist. Again, there's no way this initial setup is enough to sustain an entire series. So I know there's more to it. It's just, I only know that through meta reasoning. That's not something that was presented to me from the premiere. And, you know, it might just be that how empathetic you are for the main character will really determine how much you could actually enjoy it. Okay, next up. Super Cub. And people are going to laugh at the way I've decided to present this. But, this is a delight. All right? I know this is weird, but I don't want to tell you anything about the premise of this show. But I still want to convince you to watch the premiere. Usually when I am cagey about a show's setup, It's because there is some kind of twist or mystery, or there's some kind of dazzling sequence that I want you to see yourself, rather than just hearing my summation. That's not the case here. It's almost the opposite, where if I tell you the setup, it will sound so simple and even underwhelming that you may not bother. This is a show where the hook is not the premise, but the execution of that premise. Now, this premiere is a treat for anyone who likes visual storytelling, who likes the use of careful detail to communicate a character's life to an audience. There is considerable effort to make us understand our main girl's inner life, with very minimal access to her thoughts or observations from others. The first episode's title, The Girl with Nothing, should give a hint as what kind of spell the opening tries to weave. It's placid, it's sparse, it's very deliberately paced, and yet absolutely full of small things to immerse us in her world and appreciate how it begins to shift. Even the varying number of instruments in the soundtrack or the saturation of colors are used to tell the story rather than dialogue or thoughts or narration. In fact, it's several minutes before you hear anyone's voice at all, and nearly a third of the way in before the first conversation. That may sound unbearingly slow-paced to you without context, but I think watching it, you'll understand how well the presentation syncs up with the main character's state of mind. And as she adjusts or shifts, so too the delivery of the story. I don't think she ever says or thinks out loud anything about how she is feeling at any point, and yet you will be acutely aware of it throughout. It's low stakes compared to something like saving the world, but that's only from the point of view of the audience. What is meaningless to one can be incredibly meaningful to another. So, I want to wrap this up by giving a different kind of premise. This is a show about how small things can be big things to the right person, and how small changes can start something substantial. That there is a world of difference between a girl with something, no matter how simple or small, and a girl with nothing. Check it out, seriously. I know I say I'm not here to recommend things, but watch that first episode. All right. Moving on from that, because we have to go. I would love to talk about that some more. We keep moving. Tokyo Revengers. So, the first thing to mention, at least, when talking about Tokyo Revengers, is what I am not going to say about it. There was an anime a few years ago that makes for a very obvious comparison, but I'm not going to bring it up, and hopefully, no one will do so in chat either. I think knowing it's similar to that title wrecks the surprise of the premiere, but will be super obvious afterwards. So in the interest of preserving the novelty of the first episode, I will both avoid that comparison and any details that point that direction. Okay then, so Tokyo Revengers centers on Takamichi, a dude in his mid-20s whose life is not very enviable. Crappy apartment, dead-end job where he gets no respect, hasn't had a girlfriend in many years, is even still a virgin. Not that there's anything wrong with that, though he seems to think so. Even some punk kids can tell he's an easy mark to bully. The story begins with him seeing a news broadcast about escalating gang violence, and one of the victims turns out to be his girlfriend from middle school. His one and only girlfriend, it turns out, though it seems they haven't kept up in the ensuing decade. He will end up thinking back to those years, and sadly realize that his second year of middle school was probably when he peaked in life. Where did it all go wrong? Then he will have an occasion where his life flashes before his eyes or something, and he finds himself remembering those days in vivid detail. This leads to him exploring the answer to that question. Where did it all go wrong? Why was he the kind of guy that could attract a popular girl? And who was she that she saw that in him? And what set off the sequence of events that would lead to her death 12 years later? There's more than him just pondering these questions and reliving the height of his youth, but I'm going to have to leave that to you. I just want to comment that I liked how the combination of his life as a 26-year-old and his older perspective on his younger years really paints a picture of someone who knows they peaked early, but has never spent the time wondering why that may be. Thinking about himself as a kid from an adult perspective changes how he even remembers those halcyon days, which gives me at least a little hope that there will be a journey of introspection to accompany the more obvious narrative arc that the very end of the episode will reveal. Last thing, if you are particularly sensitive to secondhand cringe, this one might be a hard pill to swallow, at least going by the premiere. It's not by any means the worst I've seen, and I actually anticipate it to get better, but still. You've been warned. Next up. JORAN, the Princess of Snow and Blood. Alright, so for this one, what we have is an alternate history set in 1931, in which the last shogun did not actually step down and usher in the Meiji period, but continues to wield absolute power over 60 years later, thanks to a monopoly over some fantastical resource, which doesn't seem to be much actually of the story. It's thus a more modern era, but with several Edo period tales pulled along for the ride. Our main characters seem to be a little counterintelligence-esque, not a word, but I at least want to get it right, counterintelligence unit, who live in the shadows of intrigue that swirl around the shogun's government, the opposition to it, and the factions which vie for power in the underworld. There's smuggling and assassins and all that, sure, but there's also changelings and energy swords, and seemingly some other supernatural elements contending with one another. This, of course, means that there is a thread of distrust and uncertainty between the very agents we are following. The episodes have numbered case files for their names, which implies a case of the week structure, but it does seem to have a myth arc. Additionally, pushing the historical shogunate structure of Japan well into the 20th century gives a different flavor to the political intrigue that otherwise seems to bind our characters together. The premiere, at least, is very heavy on style, and this might be at least part of the reason they have this Edo period meets the modern period alternate history in the first place. Even the main girls' fights will be given their own aesthetic at certain parts. I certainly think that the narrative in the opening exists really to set up some of the visual set pieces and introduce us to its speculative concepts, and unfortunately, I think this comes at the cost of characterization. There are many hints about pre-existing relationships between the team members and the other elements of the underground, and there's a kind of shared cynicism that points towards a long and possibly dark history for each of our unit members. This has interesting overlap with the show we talked about earlier, Mars Red, in that both happen around the same time in history, both appear to follow a small, specialized unit operating within the government, and both have to contend with supernatural elements that complicate the usual cat-and-mouse game between authorities and outlaws. However, the qualities of storytelling that each prioritizes are quite different. So while it's tempting to compare them because of the overlap of premise, I feel they're actually really very different shows that are going to appeal to different groups of people. It's the one I sometimes get Mars Red mixed up with. Yes. Understandable, for reasons I didn't even bring up for either of them. It is intriguing. There are a lot of pairs today, which you'll hear me mention from time to time. It's funny how often that can happen. Alright, so next up we have Vivy, Flourite Eyes Song. This one is an original, which I'm always a fan of. It premiered with a double episode premiere, not a double length one, but put out 2 episodes. They are distinct, and I think there are sufficient developments. They're distinct, is what I'm trying to say. They're distinct, they're not a single episode. However, I think there are sufficient developments in the second one that paint a picture of the larger conflict and what it will be beyond the setup we just get from the first episode. And yes, the story here is created by our friend behind ReZero. However, despite that, I'm only going to have clips and only going to say things relative to the very first episode. But it still might be a good idea to watch both if you want a better grasp on where it's going and to see if it interests you. I do want to mention, it starts with some upsetting imagery to help set the stakes, even if the overall tone is not quite so violent or desperate. This is another one in which it is difficult to discuss the premise without giving away a lot of the premiere. I rather like how they chose to reveal certain aspects, though, so I'm going to avoid a lot of details. It might not end up making much sense because of that, but the actual setup is easy enough to understand. So don't think that my kind of vague overview here is a reflection on the series itself. So, Vivy, from the title, is the name of the world's first fully autonomous and humanoid artificial intelligence. Much more restrictive forms of AI or humanoid robots were already in existence, but Vivy and those coming after her represent an escalation in that particular arena. This is thus a not-too-distant future in which humanity is starting to come to grips with the reality of emerging and even commonplace AI or robots. And this includes grappling with things like legalities or questions of personhood. Vivy's purpose at the outset isn't anything so grand or abstract as all that. Each AI has but a single mission, or purpose, which they prioritize above everything else. Hers is simply to make people happy by singing, which she tries to do as something of a sideshow in a largely AI-run theme park. Ordinarily, she would have persisted in this role until her retirement or something, a quiet life, such as it is. Instead, she meets someone who recruits her to help stop a war between humanity and AI, which is decidedly not part of her original mission. And I think that is about as vague as I can be. Now, as dire as all that sounds, a fair amount of the opening is lightly comical, as Vivy's personality and her limited grasp of the world contrasts rather sharply with her co-star. She ends up as something of a straight man in a comedy duo at times, as well as embodying a kind of naivete that is sometimes humorous and sometimes endearingly innocent, and sometimes frustratingly stubborn. She is stuck somewhere halfway between a human and a computer in how she acts or reacts to everything that comes across. I suspect the series will get a lot of mileage out of a theme common to stories that involve artificial intelligence, which is exploring what exactly makes someone human or not. What qualities distinguish human and humane decision-making from logical decision-making? What's the difference between free will and executing a subroutine? What intrinsic value does something have if it's fully artificial? And so on. What is sometimes called artificial general intelligence may never actually exist, but it can be used in a story as a way to look at human stories through a different lens, even if the narrative is otherwise implausible. That is, that AI is a way of exploring humanity and what defines it, rather than being actually about artificial intelligence. Vivy so far seems like it sits squarely in that realm, but that doesn't mean it's the same thing that we've seen a dozen times before. I don't want to give much about the ways in which it's different, though I will offer this one. Vivy is an AI, but is being recruited to prevent a war for the sake of humans, and accomplishing this means basically impeding the evolution of her fellow artificial life forms. She is asked to use her own limited free will to deny more expansive free will to others, for the sake of those who would deny her personhood in the first place. That is maybe even more of a hook than I should give you, but I am fond of the way it introduces every other element, and I'd just rather you get that from the work than from me. Alright, so 86 so far. Again, just seen the premiere. It contains a lot of the elements that I like from the Gundam series, without it actually being some kind of Gundam redux, if that makes sense. I do at least think that the influence will be noticeable. This premiere mostly follows a young military prodigy named Lena. Her nation is at war, but a war that everyone expects to be concluded at a specific point in the future. And it's all drone warfare anyway, so it's mostly treated like a game, or a minor detail of daily life, like the weather. In fact, there is an in-universe broadcast that literally shows an update on the weather alongside an update on the war, so I'm not using hyperbole here. A lot of the episode is dedicated to giving us a look at this nation and the attitudes of the people in it. It seems like a very prosperous but very homogenous society. You wouldn't guess they were at war just looking around the citizenry, but you also wouldn't guess that with a glance around the barracks. Our main girl seems to be the only person taking it seriously at all. Others find her weird for this, but I suppose she is getting a pass because she is a prodigy, or because her family is high in the military, or something. The inciting incident for the story, then, is a promotion/transfer to a different unit that has a reputation for causing harm to their commanders. That is most of the A plot for the premiere, but there is a smaller B plot woven within where we get an introduction to the titular 86, the squad that Lena will be in command of going forward. It won't take long for it to be obvious they live in very different worlds. Certainly, you can pick up several separate details which suggest that there's something odd about this war. Overall, I think the setup provides a lot of potential, and the trick will be living up to it. This episode sacrifices some characterization for the sake of world building, but I would expect that to flip in the immediate future. There are some moments of really obvious indicating to the audience, but there's also some moments of very nice subtlety. The optimist in me believes the former is due to the amount of things that need introduction, and the latter will be more of the norm, at least at some point in the story. The direction overall especially gives me hopes, and it is visually splendid as well, as you can probably tell from these clips. Even if some things are obvious, there is a lot of show don't tell, and a lot of careful detail in the environment, or brief little exchanges, that start to fill in the corners of our understanding. But when I look back on how much was communicated in 22 minutes, it does raise my expectations for the execution going forward. Yes, this is my thought in a nutshell. I hope it's able to keep up with the world building and get further into the characters, because the first episode really was about orienting us in this world. Not super unusual for speculative fiction shows, but still. It is a little bit misbalanced coming out of the gate. Next up, then. Higehiro. After being rejected, I shaved and took in a high school runaway. Well, the title of this is almost exactly the setup, so I don't feel too bad explaining the full premiere. It starts with our man Yoshida, a 26-year-old salaryman, getting rejected by the coworker he crushes on. He drinks away his sorrows, as one does when one's rejected. And on the way home, he will stumble across a high school girl who obviously shouldn't be out so late. But she cannot go home as he recommends, because she is, well, as the title tells you, a runaway. Owing to her proposed solution, he opts to take her in for the night. At this point, you might be thinking, yeah, I've seen this one. The jazz music is going to start up any time now, right? Well, no. As from here, I need to talk about the substance of the show in a more spoilery way than I would prefer, because otherwise I think it would be easy to get the wrong idea. If you're wondering why a young man would agree to take in a teenage girl who has nothing but the clothes on her back, and wondering how she could ever repay him for his kindness, well, she's had the same thought, and she knows the obvious answer. But rather than maintaining that situation as innuendo, or using unresolved sexual tension for titillation or comedy, we have a frank discussion about her situation and how she's dealing with it. This show is adult, but not in the sense of being for adults only. Rather, the crisis for our runaway is a real scenario people can find themselves in during desperate times. And because of how our salaryman responds, this doesn't become some cheap setup for indulging fantasy, but seems more like two young people at a low point trying to help each other out. It's made some good choices in how it executes this, I think. Having him be too old for her, but not actually old, does infuse their situation with some potential sexual tension. They are not far enough apart in age for this to be any kind of father-daughter interaction. There is thus great use of male gaze as technique in our opening, where the camera will occasionally become his first-person point of view, and we in the audience are forced into a little bit of voyeurism to understand what he's seeing. From that, we more fully appreciate the discomfort of the situation, which makes it a bigger deal when he makes the decisions that he does. But it also lets us know that what he says at times is not 100% identical to what he thinks. Yet, even that element, which understandably is getting a lot of focus, that's just one among many in the potential complexities here. As there's moments of joy or appreciation for small things, there's conversations with real heart that land because of treating them like real people. You know, I confess there's a part that got me a little caught in my throat, you know? We'll see how it goes from here, but the premiere is a much more mature handling of the subject matter than I would default to assuming that I would get from just any random anime. Honestly, I feel like it's going to be very sweet at times, but potentially painful at others. It's interesting to have this at the same time as Koikimo, which people have already pointed out that, hey, the other show about a 20-something guy and a high school girl. They have enough similarity in their setup that it's natural to compare them, but they're handling their subject matter in just completely different ways. And honestly, this one's really good. This is one I haven't changed what I wrote about it, but I did get a chance to check out the second episode, and yeah, I'll be around for this one. Next up, that I can also say that about, ODDTAXI. So this is another original. It is clever so far. Like, I'm partial to originals anyway, especially for discussion. There's no problem with, you know, the source reader crowd interacting with those who haven't seen it, and there's no risk of spoilers, and everybody's on the same page. But this is not just original, it's quite original. It's definitely outside the standard anime fare. If you remember me talking about the variety of shows we have on tap this season, add this to kind of the standout examples. Now the setting, just to give you a little setup, it seems to be present-day Japan, except that everyone we've met so far is an anthropomorphized animal of some variety. And I mean everybody. Our main character is a taxi-driving walrus. His first fare is a hippo, his doctor is a gorilla, the nurse is an alpaca. Yeah, you get the idea. It's not clear whether being animals will have a large impact on how the story develops, as there are no obvious divisions like job specialization or something. But still worth knowing going into it that, yes, the characters are visually animals, but in all other ways act human so far. Now, I said this in Discord already, but reading the description for the show before I watched it, it made me think of Valhalla, cyberpunk bartender action game that we played last year, in the sense of following a main character whose job will naturally bring them into contact with a succession of members of the public. That is, we've got short interactions with random people, which provide little story vignettes, which, over time, weave together into some larger narratives. Bartenders and taxi drivers both make a good choice for this kind of setup. ODDTAXI is sort of like that, except we don't stay in the taxi the whole time. nor do we stay only in the point of view of our taxi driver. But random encounters, otherwise woven together, seems like the main shtick. Because of that, part of the appeal of the show is its banter. Top banter. Actually, it's probably the main appeal. Our walrus friend is pretty sharp-tongued, to the delight of the audience and the dismay of some of the characters. He practically invites you to underestimate him, and it's clear from the thoughts of those who know him that he can be difficult to deal with. But the viewpoint of the audience provides a little different insight, which is a pattern I expect to continue. Now, despite what I've said so far, this first episode does seem to set up several storylines that may continue for a while. So it's not just a series of disconnected conversations or little mini-episodes, nothing like that. A taxi driver being at the center of several different story threads, owing to his line of work, seems a little bit closer to the mark. I look forward to seeing how the concept is developed, because it seems like a total winner out of the gates. Next up, those Snow White notes. Alright, so this show on the surface is about playing the shamisen. That's a 3-stringed, plucked musical instrument associated with some forms of theater. It's something like a Japanese banjo, and I'm sure someone is going to be very unhappy with that description. But the shamisen just happens to be the thing that our protagonist plays. It seems, the show, seems more broadly to be about creative expression in general, about what goes into artistry and the relationship between creator and created. This is similar to how last year's Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken was not just a love letter to animation, but a celebration of art and artists as a whole. So then, our setup. A shamisen player who learned his craft at his grandfather's knee. Said grandfather has recently died, and this disrupts not only his life, but his relationship to the craft. He'll thus set off in search of, well, something, to find his sound and understand his teacher's final lesson. For the premiere at least, that quest takes him to Tokyo, and it's a bewildering experience all around. I will say that while this premiere didn't need to be double length or anything like that, it probably could have benefited from another 8 to 10 minutes. It is a bit of a speed run to set things up. That kind of thing will happen a lot in premieres with speculative fiction stories, like we've mentioned earlier, as they try to cram in some world-building tales or expedition dumps to get the audience oriented. This story, though, is set firmly in reality, so this speed run is more of the characterization variety. There's people we need to meet and understand and leave again, and they thus need to be expedient in their decisions, and in their revelations, to accommodate where the story will be by episode's end. I won't be surprised if there is actually a bit of a pacing whiplash going forward, but I do understand why they wanted to conclude the episode in the way they do, which of course I'm not going to tell you. Now don't let my nitpick here color your entire takeaway. It's rather that I think they had a very good set of ideas for how to push and pull the first characters we meet, and they might have benefited from a little more space to breathe. Basically, I liked what I saw, and I wish there had been more of it. As you might expect, there will be moments of seeing and hearing shamisen performances, and it does put in the effort to make sure the audience has everything they need to appreciate them. At least in terms of framing and the sound design. One thing that the episode does not do, which I really must commend, is it doesn't try to give us a crash course in playing the instrument, or its history, or too much about techniques or terminology. None of that is required to appreciate what they pull off for the opening, and it goes well with what I said at the beginning, that this is not about shamisens, or those who play them only, but the much wider topic of performers and artistry. I don't know when, but I'm sure we will end up a lot more informed on the subject by the end of the series. But I applaud them for emphasizing the aspects that they chose for the premiere, even if their hands seemed somewhat tied by the 23-minute constraint. So, lot of potential in this one is the main takeaway. Wish they had made the opening a little bit longer. I guess it's a great way to put it, actually. Felt like I could really hear the sounds compared to some other music-themed shows. I know it's hard to communicate that when I'm just talking up here. That's what I mean about the framing and the sound design. It needs to make you understand why the shamisen would be entrancing for people, and the bit that you get, I think, really pulls that off. And so, unfortunately, in this visual medium here, and without actually playing it for you, it's hard for me to communicate how well they pulled that off. Just as you can probably tell from the chat, they do. Alright, next up, Burning Kabaddi. If I can change my sign. There we go. So, what is Kabaddi? I'm glad you asked, as the first episode is literally called, What is Kabaddi? So they're feeling our confusion, right from the outset. How about we let the boys answer?
そもそもカバディってどんなスポーツなんだ? 熱いスポーツだね! かっこいいスポーツかな! 筋肉のぶつかり合い!
Alright, so it's at least a sport of some kind? Making this a sports anime of some kind? I feel like there's been a bit of a pattern in sports anime for a while now, where they feel like part of setting up the show needs to involve explaining why this sport is different from all those other sports, and by extension, all those other sports anime. To pull that off, our main character is introduced as a youth soccer prodigy, one famous enough to have graced the cover of magazines and had reporters follow his school choices, but he's had enough of that. In fact, he's swung the other way, hating all sports and determined to have nothing to do with them now that he's entered high school. Of course, that doesn't stop the soccer club from trying to recruit him anyway. But he is, let's say emphatic in his refusal. Forget soccer. Nowadays, he's all about that live stream life, sharing his e-wisdom with his growing audience of 6. But he's famous, right? And so wants to keep his real identity and stream identity separate. Well, that's a weird hang-up to have. Who would want to go to great lengths to protect their identity? Who'd fuss over keeping their real life a secret? Well, whether you relate to that struggle or not, our main character isn't going to have peace and quiet for his stream aspirations if clubs keep sending their first years to harass him. This leads to him going with one to decline the invitation to their club president in person. A club for a sport called Kabaddi. Thus, back to our question, what is Kabaddi? I feel like a full contact tag might be a neat summation. Part of their sales pitch is that it's a team sport that doesn't involve any equipment, which, okay. There's a small field of play, there's a few simple rules, and there's an emphasis on one's speed, elusiveness, or physicality. Oh, and one of you is chanting Kabaddi, Kabaddi, Kabaddi the whole time, which, strikes me as a sport that set itself up to be memed on just from its inception. Outside of that, it otherwise sticks to the usual sports anime script, almost too faithfully, trying to get the reluctant new guy to join the team while explaining the sport in question to the audience. A cursory peek at the other members in the club, and of course the opening credits. We're going to tell you the outcome of the early episodes anyway. In fact, the credits are the very first thing you see, so no mystery to the setup whatsoever. Overall, it's not super serious in tone, but it's not slapstick either. The sport part premiere, it seems to be grounded in reality, no weird power-ups or anything, with the character's personality being the arena which gets the lion's share of exaggeration, most of which is done for the sake of the light comedy woven throughout. I really have no complaints about the animation, which always has the potential to wreck a sports-focused anime out of the gates. There is some novelty to the sport itself for me, and I guess a lot of other viewers, but I don't think that'll carry interest by itself. So, like in most sports anime, the team's relationships is going to be what it lives or dies on. Potentially, the most interesting member is only just teased by the end, so unfortunately there's not much else I can say about its long-term prospects in the one arena where it really needs to succeed. I hope one day we figure out what is Kabaddi. They kind of answer that by the end of the episode, but why is it on fire? Why is it burning? No one answers that question for us. Maybe that's episode 2. Alright. Speaking of sports anime, I actually don't have that many this time. Backflip, or Bakuten? Bakuten? I didn't write it down, but I should have. So this is the Noitamina show this time, which as a general rule are aimed at a wider audience beyond the anime mainstream, and thus, to me at least, always worth checking out. This one is about male rhythmic gymnastics, and even in universe, we have a character perhaps echoing the audience when they say, "Boys do rhythmic gymnastics too?" I have to confess something. I was not on the right clip. No, that's not what I have to confess. What I have to confess is I did not have high hopes for this around halfway through, because almost the whole first part is a full performance, ostensibly to show both us and the main character what men's rhythmic gymnastics looks like. It's a complete end-to-end routine with a lot of spectacle, but we don't have any attachment to these characters, and so I would usually frown on that use of the precious opening minutes. However, I later realized that it's less about creating audience sympathy, and is instead about being sunk into the protagonist's bewilderment, so we can understand how intimidated and yet entranced he is. It's practically a spiritual experience for the dude, and seems to inspire him to his choice of high school. He was a baseball player, but not a very successful one, thus maintaining the tradition among sports anime where the point of view character has a background in a different sport than the one the series is based around, especially if their previous sport was more mainstream. Seriously, how did that get to be such a dominant trope? I mean, I know the answer is so that we can get them to a competent level in an expedient fashion, despite them having no previous experience, but still. The good thing is, it doesn't really mar this particular series, as being a baseball player only means that he is athletic enough to begin with. Because, let me tell you, baseball has precious little overlap with rhythmic gymnastics. I feel like this is also a challenging sport to animate well, and as you might can tell, the main set piece is rendered with some CG help, but the other instances we see are much simpler. If I was a betting man, I might wager that this means the fast tumbling sequences will be relatively rare, and far more time will be dedicated to the club membership and their interactions. That is going to be easier to animate. That's okay, because that is what all good sports anime end up being about anyway. One thing I thus like about the team members is they have some personality without being over the top. They're kind of exuberant with a touch of the delinquent. This is in contrast to our more passive and unworldly main character, though he is unabashedly sincere with his emotions. This puts him in contrast with another newcomer, so I expect right now we'll get to see 2 variations on the brand new club member experience. There's not much of her yet, but I'm also kind of a fan of our manager girl, you saw just a second ago. I feel like there's a recipe for good character interaction here, but not much of it has been shown to us yet. Neither is there much in the way of theme or any kind of high concept for the opening, which I think it's going to need to demonstrate in the next episode to have any legs. Like I said, a lot went into the spectacle of that first performance, for better or worse. SSSS.Dynazenon. Dynazenon. Ugh. When a word gets long enough, I just can't get it right. Okay, so I came to this one a little bit late in my watch, on the off chance that I felt you would need to see SSSS Gridman first, because that would make this a sequel, and therefore not part of our preview show. As near as I can tell, you do not need any pre-existing knowledge to watch this, though I feel confident that there will be nods both to Gridman and the tokusatsu tradition in general as kind of bonuses for those who are familiar. Despite not being directly connected, I found myself feeling much the same way about Dynazenon as I did back when viewing the premiere of Gridman, which is that I'm not personally keen on the whole kaiju thing, but I pretty much love everything else going on in the episode. While there is indeed a kaiju showing up and that kind of battle sequence, the episode does not revolve around it, neither in terms of time and really even in emphasis. Instead, the meat of the premiere, about 2/3 of it, concerns the introduction of characters, in a way that is almost indirect. We're served small slices out of a single day, but without full context, or exposition, or even internal monologue. You must pay attention to what little part of their life you are getting to eavesdrop upon, and extrapolate what it suggests about their starting characterization or motivations. There's not even background music of any kind throughout all these initial peeks into their lives. This not only lets the ambient sounds of each setting help the environmental immersion, there are also no subconscious cues to influence how you are supposed to feel or internalize the things that you see or the conversations you hear. There is thus a kind of effortless efficiency to how it introduces to half a dozen characters in just 15 minutes without making scenes feel rushed or have characters leaping ahead to conclusions. It excels at what you'll hear me refer to as economy of scene, which is one of the hallmarks of good direction. Now, I cannot speak with much authority about the kaiju and the Super Sentai-esque elements. They are not my area of expertise or preference. I do find it amusing to note that this series is like Gridman for me, in that it reverses my expectations with modern kaiju movies. And what I mean by that, there is a reason there is a trope called just here for Godzilla, in that a lot of big monster movies have non-monster elements largely as a way to space out the spectacle of the fights and save the budget from needing to spend 90 solid minutes on special effect glory. No one's showing up for the human drama happening all around the big guys duking it out. They're just a kind of necessary evil. For this show, though, I find myself wanting to skip past the monster fights because the human plot, all those elements, is what's compelling. I would like to think, then, that if you do enjoy the tokusatsu genre, then this becomes a fantastic marriage of strength and strength. Even without that interest, it looks like it's starting out with a strong mix of complicated characters who will not lack for any interesting ways to interact. Even though it's not my thing, once again, I am highly optimistic. I can see that as a shared sentiment. Issue have with the Gridman as well. The characterization and show don't tell elements are great. Kaiju stuff is just not my bag, baby. But it's also not a tremendous part of the episode. And so, it's not like I'm waiting for the 2 or 3 minutes I really like. It's more like most of what I'm served here is what I came for. Yeah, in the anime for the characters and their conflicts, not for the kaiju fighting. And there's nothing, wrong about it. I don't want to disparage it. But it feels different than the rest of it. The rest of it is interesting, and there's obviously some kind of mystery and supernatural speculative elements to it, and that just happens to be what it is. But if you're into that kind of thing, man, this is exactly. I think people who actually like kaiju, it probably should be the best of both worlds. That should be just a treat for people who are long fans of it. And I think this is worth mentioning as well. You should especially be optimistic after seeing how well Gridman is executed. That's one that all the way to the very last bit you are still trying to wrestle with, and you have to wait, what? And have to look back and try to understand what you just saw, and it is consistently executed almost every single episode. And there's nothing wrong with the kaiju stuff. It's just not, it's one of those things where within its genre, not all genres are very genre-y. It's not a word, let's roll with it. The kaiju stuff really is. It really is. So, and yes, I didn't mention this in the opening. Things that are in Netflix jail are not going to be on the preview today. I don't ever talk about anything that is not legally available for people in my market. All right. So for Netflix stuff, even though it's out there and they can see it in Japan, I'm sure there are places you can watch it. They won't ever be on the show. Me as a young teen, show me the fights. I don't care about that character stuff. Me now, yeah, nice fight and all. Can we go back to the character dynamics? That is precisely how I feel. And again, it sounds like I'm coming down on it. Nothing wrong with the fight stuff. Like, yeah, I can't stand there and say, oh, that was terrible, I don't like it. It's just I think your preference matters a lot for that. Anyway, next up. That was more time that I wanted to spend on that. Combatants will be dispatched. Yeah, so the first sentence I wrote after watching that is, well, that was a lot. Yeah, actually, I think the premiere of this episode is supposed to leave you a little bewildered, feeling a little bit like you were struggling to keep up with the pace of what happens and who is who and why these things and so on. A certain amount of controlled chaos can be exactly what an anime tries to invoke. However, I can't tell if they are really going for a little surreal flavor or if it's just kind of disorganized. I'm not sure the premise is even really the premise, but here goes. Our main character is apparently the only male under retirement age, and he is an agent in an evil corporation that is close to world domination. And so naturally the next step is to start conquering other planets as well. He's dispatched to do so with their trusty teleporter, and given a trusty, high-spec, pretty girl android, and ends up on a world that I think was originally supposed to host an isekai protagonist, but got these guys instead. Thus, you end up with knights and swords and royalty, alongside future tech, starring this guy in his tactical spandex, and the shotgun-toting robo-loli that is his sidekick. Or maybe he is her sidekick. The framing of the whole thing is confusing, though, because part of its comedy is that the characters can't decide if they're taking it seriously. It's like sitting in on someone's homebrew, sci-fi blended medieval fantasy roleplay campaign, where the players oscillate between going full chuny to fulfill their roles, or they break characters to mock what they were just doing, or how things are supposed to work from moment to moment. I mean, part of the setup is that you get evil points for doing evil things, which somehow convert into items or abilities like a game's cash shop. Hence why I'm still wondering if the premise is actually the premise. Anyway, the other part of the comedy is that everybody is terrible in their own way, though a lot of that humor is a bit sophomoric. Perhaps over time, as characters are fleshed out, the comedy parts can be a lot more situational or a lot more character-based, and it's perhaps unfair to judge it too much by the opening, because we meet a lot of people. The little android girl, for example, she's got good bits as a foil to the agent character. But I don't think it will take you long to crack its formula. If someone seems competent at first, prepare for them to fail repeatedly. If someone seems innocent, prepare for them to be evil. If someone seems unassuming, prepare for them to be a major threat. If someone seems monstrous, prepare for them to be harmless, and so on. In conclusion, Combatants Will Be Dispatched is a frenetic comedy of mashed-up genre tropes, but that might actually be the main idea. Don't think it's an accident. Your mileage may vary. And curiously enough, this is not part of my little script, but it's kind of like an isekai that starts without the characters coming from our world. They're definitely thrown into another world, but they don't come from a regular everyday. So it's like twice removed from our normal experience. I say that because I put it alongside the actual isekais we have. Starting off with, I've been killing slimes for 300 years and maxed out my level. So, I wanted to put the two true isekai together, but neither is what you might conjure up when you think of the genre, whether in scope or tone or even goals, and it's just one more set of two shows we're going to find ourselves naturally comparing. So, here we go. I've been killing slimes for 300 years and maxed out my level. 300 years of slimitude. This has a classic isekai setup that's so classic, they just speedrun right through it. Girl in our world dedicates herself to a career, works herself to death while shockingly young, goddess takes pity on her, lets her reincarnate in another world with a boon of her choice, and she chooses immortality and eternal youth, smart one there, so that she can basically take it easy in her next life. She ends up as a witch on the outskirts of a quiet town as a little level 1 nobody, and prepares to just live idly forever after. As the title tells you, she ends up killing slimes, but she does so because they're around and they're easy, they bring in a little extra coin, and so they actually serve her goal of idleness. A little everyday, not much thought to it. Well, if you do that long enough, it all adds up. Her preference for a quiet, idle life of relative anonymity gets a bit of a snag when it turns out she has accumulated a vast amount of skills and maxed out her level. She's accidentally overpowered and wants no part of it. So surely she'll get her wish, right? Surely no one will find out, right? Right? Anyway, this is mostly light and cute and relatively feel-good. It's comfy. Slice of life, but isekai might kind of be a good way to describe it. Might actually be where it ends up, although it's hard to say for sure from the first episode. It's got some directions it can go in. She is an isekai protagonist that doesn't want any of the things that such protagonists usually want, with the conflict going forward likely to revolve around her trying to go against type, while others try to push her the other way. Yeah, slice of next life. So the other one then is the Saint's magic power is Omnipotent. If I can get you to change, thank you. Alright, so this show is very chill and almost leisurely. And it begins when our protagonist, stop me if you heard this one, is summoned from her busy single life into a fantasy world. Following the standard script, we have a swords and sorcery society that needs assistance in the fight against demonkind, and summoning in help from another world is the go-to maneuver. However, there seems to be a glitch or a mistake or something, because they end up summoning two people to be said help. Our protagonist and another girl who I think we are to understand is younger and or prettier. The prince seems to only see that girl as the saint. Then she is whisked away to join him in saving the kingdom or whatever, while our girl is not. That means she has some time on her hands, quite a change in pace from the life she just left, and to pass the time she wanders the grounds. This eventually brings her in contact with members of a research institute, and her interest is piqued enough to keep coming around, and so she gets involved with them and their main shtick, herb lore and potion craft, for which she seems to have a knack, and I suspect it's not the end of things that she will excel at if we take the series title at face value. Now, this is another series that serves up the isekai fantasy, that chance to live in a different life circumstance in some kind of fantastical setting, with this departure from at least the average. I feel like part of the intent behind this series is to make a version of that fantasy aimed at a more female audience. Our protagonist is largely surrounded by men who are nobles or educated or both, and I'm sure they're all very beautiful, and they are impressed by her understanding and her competence. She's encouraged to work and train with them, and while she does receive some special treatment for being one of the saints, just not the one that was chosen, she's largely appreciated and praised for her scholarship. Whereas the masculine version of the power fantasy often features a hero saving the girl from some physical peril as a way to kick off the rescue romance trope, here we have the setup for its usual gender-bent variant, where the rescue takes the form of first aid or being nursed back to health, and the better to melt the frigid heart of whoever receives her ministrations. Like I said, she has a knack for the potion-making bit, and so expect some fantasy romance plot lines to jump off from there. To make sure I wasn't giving you the wrong idea, I did watch the second episode of this one, and if anything, I'd say I'm more certain that feminizing the isekai formula is a succinct way to put it. I also want to say that, because I suspect this accounts for some of the initial poor audience scoring relative to its merits, although that has changed since I wrote the script, as I'm afraid we still have people whose reactions are going to be something like, "Ew, this is for girls, 1 star." Yes, there are some uninspired, otome-based anime out there, but this isn't it. This isn't it. Now, there's no guarantee it won't follow, different self-insert pitfalls down the stretch, giving us a Mary Sue who is powered by isekai tropes. For now, though, we instead have a grounded and a frankly very cute story about a girl carving out a little life for herself in a new world after she is not thrust directly into some kingdom-saving superpowered role. It has a pace to match the setup, which I think might be the biggest adjustment to one's expectations if all you heard was isekai or fantasy when reading the description. Yeah. I love this Josei Isekai Wish Fulfillment Simulator. Yes. That's it. It's as far as a strike zone it is aiming for, I feel like the strike. I feel like it's great. But it does have that departure from Isekai. It is not the power fantasy you might have thought it was if you were rolling into this. So those were our 2 true Isekais, and both of them not at all what you would think. I know the kind of a pattern lately is to be, isekai is now a well-understood genre rather than just a thing that gets done over and over again. So each one, kind of like the sports anime I talked about earlier, it needs to establish its own identity out of the gate. It doesn't want to be written off as something generic. And that is the case for both of these, but without just being, oh, this is just a normal isekai and here's the one twist, like, oh, but I have my cell phone. Or, oh, but I'm really overpowered but didn't want to be, but I'm going to pretend I'm not. Or, yeah, you get the idea. But that's not it for these 2. And even though I talked about the, it's not a sequel, so I'm not talking about it, but how not to summon a demon lord, that makes up for the lack of the bog standard isekai. That one is, you know, it knows what it wants to be, right? I decided to put the two isekai adjacent ones on either side of the true isekais, and that means next up is going to be Full Dive. This ultimate next-gen full dive RPG is even shittier than real life. As the title indicates, we have another entry in the list of series that use the conceit of a virtual reality experience to put someone from our world into another. It's not isekai, but it's actually a lot more like an isekai than the last two titles I talked about, if that makes sense. So, what happens? Through a series of amusing circumstances, the protagonist ends up in an ultra-realistic VR MMO that he doesn't know the first thing about. But he assumes he does, and is thus surprised when it simulates things like smell or taste, and unfortunately that means it replicates pain, with some other unexpected nods to realism. It's the game world setup that I imagine we're all familiar with by now, with the variation that he is a bit wrong genre savvy. I'm struck by the notion that the series is actually meaning to have some fun at the expense of the life in a game world premise. Like, I feel like the resemblance to Kirito is intentional, and there's a whole bit near the beginning where it craps all over a certain venerable game series without naming it directly. So it's self-aware and having some fun with it. It is much more of a comedy than an adventure, but well, there's a little bit of dark humor. I find myself laughing at things that I probably shouldn't be, right? That I'm just like, oh man, that was terrible. Of course, the title should tell you that it's likely to be fraught with misadventure, so I'm not really giving anything away. I don't really want to give away how exactly it ends up by Premiere's end, because that will steal some of the funny. I will say that the game and how he gets ensnared in it has a little unique origin, and there's probably more to it than this first episode actually gives away. There is some light, ecchi titillation in the opening episode without being too egregious, but the credits may suggest that that is just the tip. The tip of the iceberg. I bring it up mostly because fan servicey elements are almost totally absent from the list of shows I'm talking about today, despite there being 25 of them, which I swear might be a record. I say my own interest in it depends a lot on whether it veers down that path, or it continues to emphasize the disaster comedy elements, while skewering its game-setting premise. Next up. I'm gonna try to speed up now. Yeah, and as mentioned, How Not to Summon a Demon Lord is gonna have you covered. You don't actually need any other help on that front. Alright, Shadow's House. That is the next one. There is these shadows in a house. Thank you for coming to my stream. Okay, but seriously, that was all I could glean from the first few minutes. It seems to me, I'll just show you, seems to me like the premiere of this anime wants you to know that the pair of characters you're actually introduced to are but two of a much larger cast of noble-seeming people involved in both idleness and curiosities, and also they seem to be living silhouettes. The blacked-out skin and hair of these folks is not stylistic. That's actually what they look like. These are the titular shadows, introduced as a family of nobles, and we get to interact with just one of them, a girl named Kate. We have found her on the day she receives a so-called living doll who serves as a personal servant, and it's actually that doll who is our main point-of-view character. Said doll is ignorant of a lot of things in general, and the situation in this strange house in particular. And so the audience being mostly constrained to her point of view means that the mystery behind both the present and that unvoiced, unnarrated opening set of scenes is likely to be teased out rather gradually. Throughout this introduction, there is an element of the uncanny, a feeling that what appear on the surface as mundane activities are shot through with some kind of otherworldly wonder or terror lurking just beyond. It might be too early to conclude that it belongs to the gothic horror tradition, but the impression it conjures in the premiere would suit that genre just fine. Indeed, aside from the flurry of unexplained opening sequences, a plot outline of this episode would be quite bare. A new servant and the noble mistress she serves meet. They spend a few days figuring out a little bit about her duties and a little bit about each other. That's it. Yet the shadows and the odd details of the arrangement practically scream at us that there is some smirking strangeness, biding its time, waiting for the moment when it's going to spill out all over the story and contrast with the banality of the day-to-day as our doll understands it. Yes, a doll eats bread. And as people are saying, you can see probably in the chat, it has a great ending credits. And the first credits are great too, they're different. Both a strong play on both fronts in a very different way. Next up, we will do The World Ends With You, the animation. Okay, so you are going to need approximately 15 seconds or so to realize this is an anime based off a video game, after which the opening minutes will strikingly resemble a new player tutorial. Most of the premiere, in fact, will be structured around introducing concepts and rule sets to us by introducing them to our main characters. This isn't terribly odd, though, because they know they are in a game, a Reaper's game, and they are the players, trying to survive the game's challenges. Now, using most of the first episode for this isn't because these details are complex. They're actually rather straightforward, and the magic system as presented is very squishy. Instead, the series so far is just rather simple, and the pace, characterizations, and the art style suggest a work meant to be all ages, and maybe even intentionally targeting a younger audience. Your mileage may vary on whether that is a sticking point or not. I'll say that the indistinct ages of the characters reminds me a bit of how they design Pokemon trainers, so it may be more about making it accessible to as wide an audience as possible. Perhaps as a result of this, there's really no nuance or subtlety to pick up on, but it also doesn't dwell over long on any particular point. Anyway, there's a lot more to the premise than what I've said, but the premiere is pretty much just methodically laying them out for you, so if I fill in the whole picture, you don't actually have a lot left to watch. I'll say that the game setup involves them clearing certain missions to stay alive, and if they do so long enough, they will presumably win. Whatever that means. Players have to be in partnerships to function, so storylines around teamwork versus individualism are likely, and the Reapers, the Shinigami, from the name of the game, in-universe game, are also characters rather than just some amorphous force. That's them there. So the conflict isn't entirely an abstraction. I have not played the game this is sourced from, so a lot of my questions about its direction, or the content, or intended audience may seem very silly to those who have, but certainly its origin as a game is unmistakable, which isn't always the case for series that are sourced from that medium. I mean, I think you can tell just by watching it that that is the case. It is indeed a distinct art style. Oh no, the stream is putting so many shows on my seasonal list. You're welcome. Or I'm sorry, whichever it is. People love the game. Yes, I know this is a very popular property, which can mean it makes a great adaptation. I don't know enough to know if that's going to be the case, because for a lot of games, the gameplay is a lot of the draw. Even strong story-based games, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you're very strong story and the gameplay is just there so it can be a game. And I don't know which one this falls into. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched a little shoujo anime and thought to yourself, I could have used a little more sparkle? Well, sit down, because I've got the show for you. If you watched the premiere, I don't think anyone would need to tell you that this was produced by Shaft, and you might also be able to surmise that Nisi Oisin was behind its story. Certainly, if you were told that, you wouldn't be surprised. It's thusly full of what I can only call visual exuberance, a kind of exaggerated aesthetic. However, it's very on theme. The Pretty Boy Detective Club's membership are not just pretty themselves, but have a kind of reverence for beauty in its different expressions. The hyper-stylized presentation will start to seem less gratuitous as the episode advances, and you learn a little bit more about the club members. So, to start over with a setup, here is the very first frame of the whole episode that lays it out with 3 rules. Be pretty. Be a boy. Be a detective. Now, I don't want you to get too tripped up on the nuance here. It's actually not being tongue-in-cheek, as the boys are indeed pretty, and are indeed in a secretive detective club. The episode follows a girl on the verge of giving up a long-held dream, who meets the president of this club and is introduced to its members, which of course introduces us to its members. They are all superlative in one way or another, but also an unexpected group to be together. What's more, their club is shrouded in mystery, and perhaps a little notoriety. Our point of view character provides narration for us, and a running commentary in her head as she meets the group, gains their assistance in an unexpected way, and, well, the episode actually cuts off in the middle of the first case where we see them in action. It's unclear if it will be structured around a succession of cases due to some of the elements in this premiere, such as the opening scene, which seems to take place sometime in the future. Now, the premise has a lot of elements that overlap with some similar shows, and I feel like you could describe the initial high concept as a cross between Ouran High School Host Club and the subgenre of series that feature mystery or problem-solving clubs as the reason that characters are brought together, like Haruhi or Higehiro. While the story so far doesn't preclude that as a direction, I feel like such a comparison leaves out a lot of the more intangible elements of this initial presentation, and that actually makes it quite different from any of those examples. There is a lot of high-minded conversation around abstractions, and an invitation for us to treat these pretty boys as a lot of pretentious nonsense. But it seems like it might be self-aware on this point, and drawing both us and our point of view girl into this supposition is one of several things the opening is up to. Some shoujo tropes are being leaned into, but simultaneously being toyed with or questioned, and I rather expect that to be a recurring pattern. Not that it's purely a send above that, but I think if you're familiar at all, you'll start to recognize them. Alright, getting near the end. Next up, Osamake. You know how many times I had to change the size of the text for this to make it fit? Anyway, for the titles today. Osamake. Romcom where the childhood friend won't lose. Okay, so just on my initial watch of this one, I didn't think it would be particularly hard to talk about. But when I sat down to write out these bits, I realized that there is precious little I can say about the setup that won't deflate some of the impact of each scene. Part of this is that there are multiple encounters within the premiere for which the outcome isn't immediately apparent, and each one kind of proceeds from the previous. But more importantly, I'm also hesitant because of something that I would put forth as a strength of this opening, which is that each interaction gives you some little hint that the surface comments or motives of those involved may not tell the complete story. They're all very minor turns in the grand scheme of things, but I feel like any way I choose to summarize them would necessarily involve me adding my own interpretation onto what happens. I've come away from the premiere without a really great handle on the main players, but this isn't because they lack characterization. Rather, you are given more than one side of them without making it plain which is the dominant, or at least the authentic part of their persona. So certainly our protagonist is conflicted between he's conflicted between what he wants to do when governed by one set of emotions versus what he wants to do when he's governed by another set of emotions. That's all really abstract, I realize. I'm just kind of apologizing for the very scant setup I will do as far as the narrative goes. So here's that goes. As you can tell from the title, this is Romcom, and it involves a childhood friend, and apparently she is determined not to lose. You can correctly surmise from this that there must be some other love interest. So, romantic rivals, both among the girls and among the guys. Our setting is high school among mostly second years, and there is a week and a half until the cultural festival where there appears to be a tradition of mass confessions. Maybe that's a timer for events, maybe not, but there's 3 separate mentions of said cultural festival, so at least some plotline or another is going to hit a major beat there. For our cast, we have our protagonist, his womanizing friend trying to prod him to action, his love interest, who is superlative in a variety of ways, and of course the childhood friend, who is no slouch herself, going by the way other guys hate our main character for being close to her. We frequently dip into our protagonist's thought process or mental imagery, but importantly, we do not do so for the other characters, leaving some ambiguity as to whether there is a gap between what they say and how they feel. I think that the childhood friend and her antics are going to be the obvious main draw, though the womanizing classmate isn't exactly out of the race. The main character seems like an appropriately conflicted foil to the people around him, and the object of his affection shows enough to reveal that she won't easily be nailed down with a simple description either. The whole setup also throws a curveball right at the end of the episode, in case we all thought the other interactions were too straightforward. Didn't loop for some reason. Outside of some of the usual romantic comedy, love polygon trappings, there does seem to be some theming around the idea of first loves, and what that even means, and how one even knows, and perhaps some of the conflicting ways that it can inspire people. That is to say that it is aspiring to something a little bit more poignant than just entertainment, but is still focused on romance, and is delivered as a comedy most of the time. If the second episode matches the first, I'll treat this one as a keeper. For sure. Yeah, this is one I'd say people to just watch it. Had it hard to say much without giving away too much, yes. It is all in the nuance of their interactions, which, again, if I summarize it for you, I blow right past it, and I'm not even sure I have the right interpretation, and I think that's most of the opening appeal. Alright, so, next up. I might be the only person to watch this. CESTVS, the Roman fighter. So to continue our phenomenon of shows in pairs this season, we have one revolving around a variant of boxing to go along with Megalobox Season 2. While that sequel is set in the near future, this one is set way back in the past, in the opening days of Nero's turn as emperor. So, hey, anime Nero as a young lad might be interesting, but the show is mostly following a plucky kid named CESTVS and his career as a slave fighter. That's a slave that's a fighter, not someone opposing the convention of slavery. Though I suspect he's not a fan, considering the premiere makes sure to remind us that being a slave really sucked. One thing odd about this premiere is that it opens with a flash-forward scene that is entirely in CG, with, I'd say, some variance in execution. But then most of the rest of the episode is regular 2D animation. This isn't the hilarity of last season with X-Arm, with mixing CG and hand-drawn in the same scene, but giving us different versions of the same character in the same episode is not exactly an order of magnitude better. Without seeing further, I would guess that the majority of the scenes will be done with the CG from the opening, as the other way around wouldn't make a lot of sense. This is appropriately thematic, because the lifelessness of the animation goes well with the lifelessness of the characters. Was that too mean? Alright, let me put that a different way. The visuals are just as inspiring as the dialogue. There's an interesting mix of historical accuracy and inaccuracy in this, too. Certain details about the beginning of Nero's reign, and the styles of fighting, clothing, architecture, and so on, seem like they arise from a desire for authenticity. Yet the basic premise, meant to infuse the story with dramatic tension, is the threat that any loss in the arena will result in your death. Which is nonsense, because gladiatorial fighters were big investments of training meant to yield returns for years. It's fair to say that degree of artistic license diminishes my expectations for the rest of the portrayal. Which is a shame, because it's a fascinating time and place in history, and they seem like they are otherwise going to concentrate on some lesser-known portrayals of Roman life. It's also the only historical anime this season that's, grounded in reality. So, I really wanted to try it out, or at least add it to our lineup. But... yeah, just in a meta way. The fact that losing equals death kind of takes the tension away, because main character can't lose now, right? It has the opposite effect. I feel like I was a reviewer and a columnist somewhere, and I had to turn in like a 500-word review on this. I would try to get away with writing 500 times. The editor might not go for it, but he might. He might if he watched it too. Alright, one that's going to be very hit or miss for basically everybody, I think, is Dragon Goes House Hunting. The Dragon Goes House Hunting is a comedy about a dragon that goes... I gotta say, there's not a lot of emphasis on imagination for titles these days, is there? We have a dragon who's in need of a place to live because he's been kicked out of his home, basically for being downright terrible at the whole dragon business. That sets him off on the quest for the legendary real estate agent, which takes him through quite the magical menagerie. We've got slimes, fairies, elves, the lava rhino. Well, some kind of world of monsters that seems based around screwing with fantasy RPG tropes. Dragons are supposed to be at the top of the food chain, and those our protagonist encounters certainly expect as much. But he defies those expectations in amusing fashion. Certainly, let's give credit for an unusual protagonist, who isn't, say, an anthropomorphized, can't say that word today, dragon wearing clothes, but we're supposed to pretend he's a real dragon, or a transforming one that is human most of the time, except there's some wings or horns or a tail, something to remind us that, they're really a dragon, but they're indistinguishable from being a human most of the time. No, he's a dragon, in size and design, and in all matters, acts like a big, incompetent lizard with wings. There's even relatively little animeification of his face or expressions. Your mileage may vary. The point of view and the sympathetic treatment that comes with it is also different than usual fantasy settings, as we see things from the monster's perspectives, which involves such considerations as making sure your new home has anti-hero countermeasures. Indeed, humans and their need to do heroic things seems like it's something of a nuisance in this world that everyone else is just trying to put up with while they live their lives. I don't know what I expected exactly from this, but the execution of it was actually a lot funnier than I anticipated from the premise. The premiere largely focuses around our main character and a little bit from one other character, but it looks like the cast expands a bit going forward, and I think a lot will thus depend on the strength of those interactions, as there's probably only just so much mileage we can get out of the setup, but gonna have to wait on that. The premiere itself only got stronger as it went along, so I hope that means that rounding out the character lineup will give the whole show some legs. There's really only a handful of shows this time that are primarily comedy, so I guess I'm hoping this will end up being the little dragon that could. Yes. It is not just a cute girl with a tail and a single fang, but she's really a dragon. And it's true. Anthropomorphized dragon would have been much easier on the animators. It's kind of like, I kind of want to give credit for going for the very unusual way of doing the main character, although I know it's not going to be some people's cup of tea. But in some ways, it just makes his awkwardness that much more awkward, which, yeah. The world's not kind to him. You know, comedies need to walk a fine line between audience entertainment and audience sympathy. You can't be too mean-spirited, like Nagatoro we talked about earlier, without starting to lose the audience, right? Like, we need a reason it's okay for that to happen. Another one we talked about, Combatants Will Be Dispatched. Everybody's so terrible, you're kind of okay that things don't go their way. It's kind of hilarious to see them fail and try again and fail even more spectacularly. Our little dragon here walking the line so far, because a lot of bad things happen to him, but he's kind of a useless whiner, so it's kind of like, just don't feel as sorry for you as I might have otherwise. Which maybe that's just a reflection on me, but it doesn't come off as mean-spirited just because of that. Plus he has his moments to fire back, so. Alright, last show. Believe it or not, that was 24, this is 25. To Your Eternity. Watching the show is one thing, and talking about it is another, right? This is one where I think the less I say, the better. I think it's very appropriate that you roll into this with a mostly blank slate, because part of the setup itself involves an entity that is a blank slate itself. I'll give you the initial premise at least, which is that some being or another that also provides narration releases this orb thingy onto Earth, and the orb's shtick is that it reflects its environment. Not in the sense of a mirrored ball bearing, but that it actually takes on and becomes a thing from that environment. It starts in some far north or far south region with severe winters. After a few steps, we see it become a white wolf, but it is truly tabula rasa, and at first doesn't even know how to wolf properly, or conceive of something as simple as what food is. The bulk of the episode involves this wolf entity meeting a boy living alone in a small encampment, and their day-to-day as companions, as the boy talks to the wolf about his situation and his thoughts and his plans. I think that is enough as far as initial details, and I don't want to conjecture anything about its direction from here. I'll say that the experience is highly linked to the way it paints the environment, and the audience is given something of an observer role in the same way as our orb come wolf. However, the two experiences are like to be opposite. See, there's a lot of there's a lot of reading between the lines to surmise what is going on compared to the surface presentation from the boy. And I don't mean in the sense of it being mysterious. In fact, that's closer to a feeling of the inevitable. Rather, I mean that the orb wolf's observation is one that is stripped entirely of context, a being with no grasp at all of humans or our tendencies or the little stories we tell to make sense of our world. Meanwhile, we in the audience are humans, I presume, and we're familiar with said tendencies, so we understand things about the boy and his interaction with the wolf that it cannot appreciate. I actually think the net effect of that is it puts added emphasis on our capacity to hear what is not actually said. I know that's all really abstract if you haven't seen the episode, but I bring it up because I suspect that kind of presentation will be part of the appeal of the show going forward. The setup seems primed to explore the human experience from the point of view of an entity with no pre-existing understanding and no pre-existing assumption about what human experience means. And that is the end of 25 shows.